the U.S. military ordered the development of the Consolidated B-32 Dominator 4-engine heavy bomber. This happened at almost the exact same time as the legendary Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Why did the Army decide to simultaneously fund two aircraft built for the exact same purpose? The answer is pretty simple. It was a backup plan. The War Department wanted a solid insurance policy just in case Boeing's highly ambitious project fell through. But the B-29 turned out to be so successful that the need for its competitor practically vanished. Because of this, the B-32 was produced in very limited numbers. It only saw combat during the final few weeks of the war. Even so, these bombers secured their place in history. They are remembered as the aircraft that flew the very last combat mission over Japan at the end of World War II. To understand how this all started, let's rewind to early 1939. The chief of the U.S. Army Air Corps at the time was General Henry Hap Arnold. He was watching with great concern as a massive war loomed over Europe and the Far East. Realizing the scale of the threat, he formed a special committee. It was led by Brigadier General Walter G. Kilner. This group's main job was to figure out exactly what kind of combat aircraft the U.S. would need in the near future. By the summer of that same year, the committee reached a conclusion. The Army urgently needed a whole new generation of medium and heavy bombers. When war broke out in the fall of 1939, General Arnold immediately reached out to leading aircraft manufacturers. He wanted them to develop a very long-range bomber. The Army demanded that this new aircraft completely outperform the existing B-17 and B-24 across the board. They were looking for a massive increase in range, a heavier payload, and significantly stronger defensive armament. By the end of the year, the project got the official green light. A team of engineers led by Captain Donald L. Putt got to work. Stationed at Wright Field, they started drafting the detailed official requirements for this next-generation heavy bomber. In January 1940, the Army issued its official specs. The new bomber needed to hit a top speed of at least 400 miles per hour. On top of that, it had to have a range of 5,333 miles. It also needed to carry a payload of at least 2,000 pounds. But by the spring, those requirements had to be urgently revised. Air Corps planners were closely analyzing the early air battles over Europe. They quickly realized that the aircraft needed far better survivability. The updated requirements called for heavier defensive armament, thicker armor plating, and self-sealing fuel tanks to limit battle damage. All these strict criteria made up the final technical request. The War Department officially sent this out to 4 major aircraft manufacturers. These were Boeing, Consolidated, Douglas, and Lockheed. In the summer of 1940, the War Department signed contracts for preliminary designs with all 4 companies. The military even ranked them by priority. They considered Boeing's XB-29 the most promising. This was followed by Lockheed's XB-30 and Douglas's XB-31. Consolidated's XB-32 came in dead last. Pretty quickly, Lockheed and Douglas took a hard look at their existing workloads. They decided to drop out of the race. Boeing and Consolidated, on the other hand, pushed forward with their designs. Late that summer, the Army ordered 2 flying prototypes of the XB-29 from Boeing, plus an extra airframe for static ground testing. Right around that time, the military wanted to hedge against potential delays. They placed a backup order with Consolidated for 2 XB-32 prototypes. They later added funding to the contract for a 3rd aircraft. The requirements were strict. The manufacturer had to deliver the first completed XB-32 no later than 18 months after signing the contract. The second prototype was expected 3 months after that. The third one was due 90 days later. Internally at Consolidated, the new XB-32 bomber received the company designation Model 33. Externally, this aircraft looked a lot like the famous B-24 Liberator. It featured the same distinctive twin-tail design, a high-mounted wing, and identical bomb bays with signature roll-up doors. But there were some major differences too. For starters, the XB-32 had a much larger wing and a round tube-like fuselage. Originally, it was designed with a fully glazed, all-glass nose, no stepped windshield, just a smooth, frameless enclosure that wrapped right around the cockpit, very similar to what Boeing was doing on the XB-29. However, shortly before the first flight, engineers reversed course. They went back to a conventional stepped cockpit. Powering this giant were four massive Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone air-cooled radial engines complete with turbo superchargers. Just like on the B-29, designers prioritized crew comfort by installing pressurized compartments. This allowed for high-altitude operations without the need for oxygen masks. The bomber's defensive armament consisted of remotely controlled machine gun turrets. Interestingly, unlike the B-29, the defensive turrets on the B-32 were not fixed in place. Instead, they were retractable. They extended from the fuselage only when needed. Work on the project progressed rapidly. Full-scale mock-ups of the B-32 were ready by the end of December 1940. To refine the aerodynamics, engineers built a precise scale model, 1/35th the size of the actual aircraft. They put it through extensive wind tunnel testing at Wright Field. The results of these tests forced the design team to make a series of major aerodynamic changes. After updating the mock-ups, the Military Review Board evaluated the design one more time. They gave the official green light on January 6, 1941. The project looked so promising that by June, the military went ahead. They ordered 13 pre-production aircraft for operational testing, designated as the YB-32. These were slated to be built concurrently with the first 3 experimental XB-32 prototypes. The first completed XB-32 rolled out of the San Diego factory in early September 1942. Assembly was running nearly 6 months behind schedule. Time was of the essence, as the B-32 played a critical role in the American military's strategic planning. Back in August 1941, planners had drawn up a massive campaign to bomb German industrial targets. To pull this off, they needed 98 bomber squadrons. 48 of them were slated to fly the brand new B-29 and B-32 heavy bombers. Production delays were seriously worrying the leadership of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The first XB-32 was completed 2 weeks ahead of its main rival, the XB-29. Because of this, the generals demanded the aircraft get airborne immediately. The military was so pressed for time that they ordered flight testing to begin without delay. They completely ignored the fact that the cabin pressurization system and those retractable machine gun turrets were still plagued by serious technical issues. The historic maiden flight of the XB-32 took place on September 7, 1942, at Lindbergh Field. Veteran test pilots Russell Rogers and Richard McMakin took the controls of the massive bomber. However, the debut didn't exactly go as planned. Almost immediately after takeoff, severe rudder control issues cropped up. The situation got so critical that the crew had to make an emergency landing. They brought the plane down at nearby Naval Air Station North Island. Because of this frustrating failure, the B-32's first flight lasted all of 20 minutes. On the very first prototype, engineers experimented with the power plants. They installed one variant of the R-3350 engine on the inboard positions, and a slightly different version on the outboards. All 4 engines drove identical, massive, 3-blade Hamilton Standard Hydromatic constant-speed propellers. Later on, the XB-32 was fitted with some incredibly heavy armament. Retractable, remotely operated turrets were installed on the top and bottom of the fuselage. Each packed 4 50 caliber machine guns. But even that did not seem like enough. In the rear sections of the outboard engine nacelles, they mounted 2 more 50 caliber machine guns. They also included a 20mm automatic cannon. These rear-facing weapons were designed to fend off enemy fighters attacking the tail. They were remotely operated by gunners from 2 different stations inside the aircraft. Adding to this arsenal, 2 more 50 caliber machine guns were built right into the wing's leading edges. They fired just past the outboard propeller blades. With coverage from nearly every angle, the aircraft was about as bristling with guns as anything flying at the time. Problems with the aircraft persisted. In February 1943, the military contract for the YB-32 was completely canceled. However, just a month later, things unexpectedly turned around. A new contract was signed with Consolidated for 300 B-32 bombers. It is worth noting that some high-ranking officers in the U.S. Army Air Forces were dead set against this decision. They wanted to scrap the B-32 program entirely. A parallel project was progressing much faster and showing a lot more promise. This was the famous B-29. The new batch of B-32s was slated for assembly at a massive plant in Fort Worth. This was despite the fact that the first test articles were built in San Diego. This new bomber was initially given the name Terminator, but on May 10, 1943, tragedy struck. Shortly after takeoff, the first XB-32 prototype lost control. It crashed due to a severe flap failure. In the horrific crash, 6 crew members were severely injured. The company chief test pilot, Richard McMakin, tragically lost his life. This disaster severely set back the entire B-32 development program. To make matters worse, all their hard-won flight test data went up with the wreck. This meant engineers practically had to start the complex testing process from scratch. The second XB-32 prototype made its first flight on July 2, 1943. Engineers retained its distinctive twin-tail design. They tweaked the rudder control mechanisms to improve the bomber's handling. This aircraft featured pressurized crew compartments for comfort at high altitudes. On top of that, it was equipped with what were then state-of-the-art remote turrets. There was one dorsal and one ventral turret. They were remotely operated and could completely retract into the fuselage when not in use. This significantly reduced drag and improved the overall aerodynamics of the bomber. The first flight of the third XB-32 prototype was repeatedly delayed. Endless technical issues plagued the aircraft at every turn. It was finally fully assembled on November 9, 1943. However, by that time, it retained a few design choices that the Army Air Forces considered completely unacceptable. As a result, in December 1943, the Army Air Forces had seen enough. The B-32 as it stood was hopelessly outdated by contemporary aviation standards. To keep this ambitious project from being scrapped, the military demanded that Consolidated make major design changes. Commanders felt the defensive firepower on the XB-32 was just too weak. Engineers were ordered to ditch the complex remote-controlled turrets and revert to traditional manned installations. The armament was also beefed up with 50-caliber machine guns. These were mounted in pairs in the nose, tail, belly, and 2 upper turrets. This turned the bomber into a formidable gun platform. Beyond the guns, designers completely reworked the engine nacelles. They swapped the old 3-blade propellers for more efficient 4-blade designs. Since the new tactics meant the B-32 would be operating exclusively at low and medium altitudes, they completely dropped the complicated cabin pressurization system. This shaved a significant amount of weight off the aircraft. It allowed them to bump the maximum bomb load up to an impressive 20,000 pounds. Engineers also made major improvements to the engine fuel and oil systems. They also increased the reliability of the bomb release mechanism. On top of that, they installed a new autopilot. They also added new emergency exits for crew safety. Up front, the nose received an Emerson 128 turret. This was very similar to the one successfully used on the B-24 Liberator. These upgrades were so extensive that it was essentially a different airplane in all but name. The third XB-32 prototype became the primary testbed for all these radical changes. After its 25th test flight, it was fitted with a new single vertical stabilizer borrowed directly from Boeing. Standing 16.5 feet tall, it closely resembled the tail on its successful rival, the B-29 Superfortress. In practice, however, this new tail failed to meet designers' expectations. So the team at Consolidated took matters into their own hands. They designed an even larger vertical stabilizer, standing 19 feet 6 inches tall. This massive structure successfully passed its initial flight tests. This happened on that same third XB-32 prototype on November 3, 1943. It performed so well that it ultimately became the permanent standard. It was used for all future production B-32s. With all the necessary changes made, the project received a new company designation, Model 34. The Army Air Forces believed in this bomber so much that they significantly expanded their order. This brought it to nearly 1,500 aircraft. To handle this massive production volume, the work was split across multiple factories, similar to how they'd handled the B-24 program. The setup worked like this. The San Diego plant assembled fuselage sections for the factory in Fort Worth. Fort Worth, in turn, built completed wings and shipped them back to San Diego. Additional power plant components were scheduled to be built in Downey. Meanwhile, production of the rudders and the engines was handed over to General Motors at their Chicago plant. In August 1944, the aircraft finally got a name, Dominator. However, that name lasted exactly a year. By August 1945, official objections came from the United States State Department during a United Nations conference. Because of this, the name was quietly retired. The real motives behind this decision still remain a mystery to historians. That said, most researchers agree on one thing. In the post-war world, Dominator just sounded way too aggressive. Politically, it was a liability. From then on, all documents referred to this bomber strictly by its military designation. It was known as just the B-32. The first production B-32 to roll off the assembly line in Fort Worth initially featured the same vertical stabilizer as the famous B-29, but Consolidated engineers later swapped it out for their own design. It was a significantly taller tail. When it came to defensive armament, the production bombers packed a serious punch. They carried 10 50 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine guns. These were mounted in pairs. They were in the nose, the tail, the belly, and in 2 upper turrets. Built by Martin, those 2 electrically powered upper turrets featured a teardrop design. Meanwhile, Sperry supplied the electro-hydraulic ball turrets for the nose, tail, and belly positions. Interestingly, the belly turret was retractable, though even when stowed, it still protruded just a bit beyond the fuselage. The U.S. Army Air Forces took delivery of its very first B-32 on September 19, 1944. But that day turned into a total disaster. During landing, the nose gear simply collapsed and the bomber crashed. Due to severe production issues, the delivery of the next airframe had to be pushed back all the way to late November. In the meantime, the aircraft was put through rigorous operational testing at various air bases across the U.S., including in Florida and Ohio. Production rates left a lot to be desired. By the end of December 1944, only 5 brand-new aircraft had made it to the various testing centers. And this was happening while its main rival, the B-29 Superfortress, had already been flying active combat missions in the Pacific for almost 6 months. By mid-December, the U.S. Army Air Forces Command was starting to grow seriously concerned. The B-32 program was stalling out, and the problems were just snowballing. The few aircraft that had actually reached the military suffered from constant mechanical breakdowns, while pilots and ground crews flooded the brass with complaints about the terrible build quality. It got so bad that several high-ranking officers openly suggested pulling the plug on the B-32 project entirely and transferring all the trained crews over to units flying the proven B-29. But the program was saved by Brigadier General Donald Wilson. In his official report, he argued that despite all the endless technical headaches, scrapping the project would be a huge mistake. The general pushed hard to run a full, thorough flight test program. In his view, that was the only way to objectively assess the bomber's true capabilities and make a final call. On top of that, he strongly recommended that they keep training new crews without interruption. To train these pilots, the military received a batch of 40 dedicated trainer aircraft in late January 1945. These were given the new designation TB-32. They completely stripped all the machine gun turrets and bombing gear right out of these aircraft. And to maintain the proper weight and balance, heavy ballast was loaded inside to replace the weight of the missing weapons. The training course for an aircraft commander in the TB-32 required 50 hours of flight time. Co-pilots were given 25 hours of hands-on practice at the controls. They also had to log another 25 hours in the air strictly as observers, getting a feel for the quirks of this big, demanding heavy bomber. Once the B-32 entered active service, the problems started piling up fast. For starters, the noise level inside the cockpit was absolutely unbearable. The instrument panel layout was so poorly arranged it constantly got in the crew's way. Bombardier visibility was terribly restricted, and the airframe was simply underpowered for its weight. Worse yet, engine accessories constantly failed, and a flawed nacelle design led to frequent in-flight engine fires. The landing gear was also prone to collapse. Things got so bad that in May 1945, the brass had to ground the entire fleet until engineers could iron out the underlying issues. To be fair, the B-32 did have its strong points. The aircraft had excellent low-speed handling, smooth takeoff and landing characteristics, and highly responsive flight controls. It was a highly stable bombing platform. The gun turrets provided reliable defense, and internal systems were well laid out for easy maintenance. Furthermore, reversible pitch propellers on the inboard engines gave pilots exceptional precision during rollout and taxiing. Engineers eventually cured most of the teething troubles from the early trials. On later production blocks, they reworked the problem areas and significantly tightened factory quality control. In August 1944, Army Air Forces Command directed that the B-32 undergo combat testing. This was to happen even before its official acceptance into service. Flight test agencies were strictly against rushing the process, but circumstances dictated otherwise. Meanwhile, General George Kenney, commander of the Far East Air Forces, was demanding the new B-29 Superfortress. He was turned down every time. All available B-29s were desperately needed in other theaters. Realizing the wait was hopeless, Kenney asked for a batch of B-32s as an alternative. On March 27, 1945, General Hap Arnold finally approved the request. This gave the green light for full-scale combat trials of the Dominator. Colonel Frank R. Cook was put in charge of the experimental unit. 3 new B-32s were selected for the combat evaluation. However, one of the aircraft was damaged in a ground accident before even leaving Fort Worth. It had to be urgently replaced. The backup airframe was far from pristine. It had already been run ragged during grueling factory tests. The first 2 bombers reached Luzon on May 24th. The battered backup arrived a day later. The trials were hosted by the 316th Bombardment Squadron. The plan was simple. If the B-32s performed well, they would replace the squadron's aging A-20 Havocs. The B-32 flew its first combat mission on May 29, 1945. The target was a Japanese supply base in Luzon's Cagayan Valley. All 3 Dominators were slated for the raid, but the worn-out backup aircraft was scrubbed at the last minute. The other 2 bombers reached the target without a hitch. They dropped their payloads from 10,000 feet and returned to base without incident. Later on, these bombers flew a series of raids against Japanese targets. These targets were located in the Philippines, Formosa, Hainan Island, and the Gulf of Tonkin. During this time, the crews faced little to no serious resistance. The only real threat to the bombers was mostly inaccurate enemy flak. These combat trials were ultimately considered a major success. Army Air Forces leadership decided to officially transition the 386th Bombardment Squadron to the new B-32s. After that, the plan was to move the entire 312th Bombardment Group closer to Japan. They would be based on Okinawa. In August 1945, immediately following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the 312th received urgent orders. They were told to deploy to Okinawa. A few days later, 6 more B-32 heavy bombers arrived to join them. By then, major combat operations had largely wound down. The B-32s mostly flew uneventful photo recon missions. No enemy aircraft showed up. However, on August 17th, that quiet streak ended. A flight of 4 B-32s over Tokyo suddenly came under fire from radar-guided flak. This was followed shortly by attacks from Japanese fighters. The bombers escaped with only minor damage. Meanwhile, the gunners claimed 1 confirmed kill and 2 probables. The next day, August 18th, they flew another recon flight over the Japanese capital. During this mission, 2 B-32s were jumped by fighters once again. The gunners claimed 2 confirmed kills and another probable. This time, however, one of the bombers took heavy damage. 1 crew member was killed and 2 were wounded. As it turned out, this would be the final aerial combat of World War II. The Dominator's final operational mission was a 4-ship recon flight over Tokyo. This took place on August 28th. Even though they faced no enemy resistance, the mission ended in tragedy. During takeoff, one of the B-32s suffered a sudden engine failure. This caused the massive bomber to slam back down onto the runway. The heavy impact caused the aircraft to explode. This killed all 13 crew members on board. The tragedy did not end there, though. On the return leg from Tokyo, another B-32 lost 2 of its 4 engines. The aircraft commander was forced to order the crew to bail out of the crippled bomber. Tragically, 2 men died during the bailout. Shortly after the victory over Japan, all surviving B-32s returned to the States. With the war over, further production of the bomber was abruptly canceled in the fall of 1945. By the time the assembly lines shut down, the Fort Worth plant had rolled out 74 combat-ready B-32s and 40 TB-32 trainers. Meanwhile, the San Diego facility had built just a single airframe. The last 6 fully completed Dominators were flown straight from the factory to storage facilities in Arizona. Another 12 aircraft in the final stages of assembly were quickly finished. They were also sent off to gather dust. The fate of the remaining fleet was even bleaker. At least 37 unfinished airframes were stripped of all valuable government equipment. They were then simply scrapped for parts. The airworthy bombers were ferried off to salvage depots. The ones that couldn't fly were cut up where they sat. By 1947, the vast majority of these massive bombers had been reduced to scrap metal. No B-32 ever saw service with a foreign air force, and because of its notoriously poor mechanical reliability, no one wanted it on the post-war civilian market either. Only one private buyer ever showed interest in the aircraft. In June 1947, fountain pen magnate Milton Reynolds announced plans to buy a B-32. He intended to use it for an ambitious around-the-world flight over both poles. However, the plan never actually materialized. Sadly, not a single B-32 survives intact today. One airframe was originally set aside for display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. But for reasons that remain a mystery, it was suddenly declared surplus in August 1949. It was then unceremoniously scrapped. Today, historians and aviation enthusiasts are left with only small fragments of this once mighty bomber. For instance, a B-32 nose turret is preserved at the Smithsonian Restoration Facility in Maryland. Another nose turret is on display at an aviation museum in Minnesota. And a massive wing section, originally used for static testing, now sits on a hill in a San Diego suburb. It serves as a memorial to American aviation pioneer John J. Montgomery.